this idea of Marxism has become, it's in the news again. Donald Trump accuses Kamala Harris as being a Marxist or a communist. She, in turn, accuses him being a fascist. These are terms which people really sometimes don't grasp. I mean, to be a good Marxist, you have to be intelligent and well educated. There are some bad Marxists. I mean, I think Kamala Harris is really not either educated enough or intelligent enough to be a Marxist. She's a collectivist. She's a social democrat. And of course, Trump is pretty much the same. They're not much different. So I want to give you guys some background, some terminology, so that you will be equipped to understand what these terms really mean. Uh, the In the end, the real debate in politics is about whether or not you want to have a political system based on compulsion, force, violence, or if you want a political system that's based upon consent, harmony, and so on. So, uh, this is kind of a ridiculous statement. This is attributed to Joseph Stalin, the great dictator of the Soviet Union. He said, the theories of Marx are true because they're correct. It's an empty statement. But again, in politics, you get away with empty statements. Now, there really are not many good Marxist economists. Because to be a good economist, you really can't be a Marxist. Marx was a brilliant philosopher. He constructed a very complex, of course, he took bits and pieces from other philosophers, other social thinkers. But just as a physicist could not believe that the earth was flat, a good economist would not embrace Marxism. It's not that you're not intelligent, it's not that you're uneducated, it's just that it's inconsistent. And I'll try to explain why I believe that's true. Now, the basis of this is that in order to examine, the human condition, I mean, this is really what social science is about. What is it that makes us live together in a community? What is the best way for us to live together? How can we discover a political system that will deliver the kind of harmonious, peaceful existence that we would all like? Now, in order to be a good economist, I'm going to assert here, you have to understand scarcity. So, scarcity is the beginning and the end of economics. We study economics because things are scarce. We want more of things than there are available, whether or not it's energy. We want more energy. It's costly to produce energy. And so this creates uh, an inescapable feature of human life. Now, the most important aspect, I think the most clear aspect of scarcity that all of you will be familiar with and as a way of understanding scarcity is your mortality. That is the limitation of how many days, months, and years you will be alive. Now, if you live forever, there would be fewer economic problems. That is, you could wait until you got more of this or that. There would be no urgency for you to have a degree. You wouldn't study at Model Keen. You could study at Model Keen in 1,000 years. You wouldn't have to do it today because you live forever, but you don't live forever. So mortality gives us an urgency to decide, to make choices, to make plans. So this aspect of scarcity is something that affects all of us. And it's not only the mortality, it's also the avail. So mortality means that time is a scarce resource. But there are other scarce resources, right? Iron ore, petroleum, elote, many different things. They're all scarce in the sense that we want more of them. I mean, don't all of you want more life rather than less life? Certainly. We want more elote rather than less elote. More tequila rather than less tequila, if you enjoy tequila. Now, the, the thing is, another aspect of scarcity is that if I have it and I'm using it, it cannot be available to you. I mean, it's a matter of logic. The phone in my pocket, the resources that were used to make this phone that I have in my pocket are not available to make the phone that you have in your pocket. So this is another important aspect. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that Karl Marx did not begin his analysis of the human condition with scarcity, and therefore he made mistakes. And therefore, in any so-called someone who wants to pretend to be an economist, if they don't begin with scarcity, they are not really approaching the questions about the human condition that will be revealed if you begin with this. Now, scarcity is all about conflict. That is, if you want to have a phone, the resources that go into my phone are in conflict with being used to make a phone that you might buy. So scarcity means there is conflict over the use of resources. So you can resolve this with violence, slavery, or theft. Sounds like government, doesn't it? Or you can resolve it with cooperation, individual freedom, not slavery, and voluntary trade, not theft. Sounds like the market. Now, Marx saw the outcomes of the market being based upon capitalism and the private ownership of capital as a serious social problem that needed to be fixed. And the elimination of private property was the mechanism. So, because scarcity requires planning, planning is an essential element of life. You had to plan to be here on time. You had to be dressed and ready to go out the door, or maybe you were already here, but you had to plan to be able to be on time to make this particular lecture or some other ones. Now, we can have centralized planning, which is what happens with Marxism. Communism was, one of the essential elements of communism was central planning, where an elite, the Bolsheviks and the Soviet Union, decided for everyone else. That's how the distribution of resources was decided. That the elite decided what was good for everyone else. Now, on the other hand, there's a decentralized market economy where each individual chooses pretty much, like you decide, do you want blue jeans instead of uh, uh, dress or shorts or whatever. So you have to plan for these things. This is, an individual choice for us to achieve these things. Again, one of these sounds like the state, government, and the other one sounds like the market. So we have politics versus markets. Now, for Karl Marx, the problem was private ownership of capital. And socialism would solve it. So if we have socialized ownership, then we'll solve the problems that come out of capitalism. And I'll talk about what Marx thought. I'll give you a brief, alienation, exploitation, class struggle, and so on. These were things that Marx said, well, we can solve all those problems if we have socialism. Now, Adam Smith was a real economist. Adam Smith said, no, private ownership is the way to solve these human problems. That is, the conflicts that emerge that Marx saw as exploitation, alienation, and so on. We could solve these problems, not 100%, because Smith was not a utopian. He didn't believe that markets would solve every problem of humanity. But what we would find is that most of these problems would be uh, softened or made less complicated. So private ownership was the way to solve the problem of the conflict over the use of resources. Now, Marx was brilliant. Uh, well, he was a bit of a sociopath, a misogynist. Marx had a lot of personal problems, but in terms of his philosophical constructs, these were pretty brilliant. I mean, it was a very, I mean, in order to read Das Kapital, uh, it takes a great deal, almost as much patience as reading Human Action by Ludwig von Mises, because both of them were Germans, and the German construction of thoughts is, they have no sympathy for readers. They have sentences are paragraphs long, and paragraphs are pages long. Um, so it, but the problem is that Marx and his followers relied upon flawed assertions, flawed assumptions, flawed insights. Uh, what happened is what we saw where we began to see these experiments with Marxism in the Soviet Union, for example, or China. We had massive political oppression and social decay. Uh, we had economic underdevelopment, or we had spiritual decay. What we saw, like in Cambodia with the killing fields. I mean, the value of the human life was inconsequential. You know, no value for humans. You just destroy them. And 1/3 of the population of Cambodia was murdered by the regime. In China, uh, something of the order of 60 million campesinos died in China because of different central government policies. Soviet Union, they liquidated, they sent people to gulags, they killed off the best and brightest Bolsheviks so that they would not challenge Stalin. So again, human life had no meaning to them. So the problem was they mischaracterized and really didn't understand the human condition. And the human condition to me is scarcity. The way we live and the way we are forced to live in a way is brought about by this sort of joke that God played on us by making things scarce. And he said, okay, now you have to sort that out. That was the joke on humans. You have to find out how you can live with each other in a world characterized by scarcity. That is the basic human problem. It's not simply an economic problem, but if you don't grasp that, you can't do good economics. So Marx started with production relations, in other words, ownership. So they were these private owners, these capitalists that were the private owners, and they didn't care about the workers. Now, Karl Marx was a philosopher, he was an intellectual. He never owned a business. He never borrowed money and took risks. He never hired people to run a manufacturing concern or so on. He hired maybe maids and servants and mistreated them, by the way, but that's a different story. But I think what happens is that when you are detached from the human conditions of life, being an entrepreneur, being a manager, being a risk taker, being a worker, you really don't understand what life is like. And I think this, again, many academics are like that. Uh, Maybe I'm perhaps guilty of some of my own accusations there. But the thing is, uh, Marx constructed his ideas on air. He never asked, well, we do have private ownership of capital, but is there a reason for that? I mean, is there a benefit from that? Now, Adam Smith anguished. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher. He anguished over the, the selfish nature of human beings, the self-interested. And he really felt uncomfortable with that in the beginning. But then he said, but wow, self-interest. As long as there is an open and free and competitive economy, that self-interest can lead to social harmony, social gains. So Adam Smith was like, wow, this terrible aspect of humanity, self-interest, actually is socially beneficial. Whereas Karl Marx said, no, 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 no. It's only evil. It's only exploitative. It's only, it's a bad thing. The only way to escape it is to socialize the ownership of the means of production. Now, Marx's system is known as historical materialism. The problem is Marx really didn't understand history. His understanding, it's as though he had on a certain pair of glasses that only allowed him to see according to the constructs that he created. So he really misinterpreted history. He said that history was a story of class struggle. No, history was humans struggling with the problems of scarcity. How do we resolve the problems arising from scarcity? How do we resolve the conflicts arising from scarcity? That's what history was all about. They didn't understand materialism. If materialism is, the sort of material condition of humanity, the things that we have, our living standards. Marx only saw the bad bits of it. He never saw that, the conditions of humans in the year 0, in his mind, was the same as the human condition in the year 1850. He didn't understand the material gains that had occurred. And of course, he couldn't anticipate the material gains, the material improvement of humanity from 1850 until 1950 until 2024. Now, Marx's predictions of the future were utterly wrong because he saw that capitalism would lead to continued misery. And that misery, especially of the working class, would inspire them to rise up in revolt to attack the private owners of capital. And this would eventually lead to a socialist sort of utopia where social ownership of the means of production would improve the condition of humans. And in fact, we see exact opposite, where we had these really serious experiments with socialism in the Soviet Union, and Red China, North Korea, Venezuela. We see misery as the outcome, not harmony, not advancement, not spiritual gains. Whereas where we have more or less capitalist market-oriented economies, we've seen advances in the living standard, possibilities of spiritual gains, possibilities of rising standard of living. And in fact, most countries have enjoyed that. Now, so what we see is that human behavior has not only the individual aspect, that is, you decide how you're going to behave, but you do so within a social context. So my discussion about this is not ignoring the social context of human behavior. In fact, much of what we do is because we are living in a social framework. Now, Marx had this idea that the collective was the most important element. So we would talk about the nation, the race, the culture. So this actually opens itself up to a lot of different things. The collective is some sort of aggregation of a group of individuals. Now, on the other hand, what he was fighting against was liberalism or individualism. So we have socialism, Marxism, communism, whatever, versus liberalism, the market, capitalism, and so on. Now, under liberalism, the individual is the beginning of social analysis. It is the most important aspect of social analysis. In a way, it's this kind of misunderstanding I believe that Marx has is this: if you're trying to talk about a forest being a collection of trees, but if you ignore the condition of the individual tree, you cannot have a healthy forest. I mean, you can't begin your analysis with the forest if you ignore the components of that forest, which are individual trees. The same thing in humanity. It is the individual human condition that determines whether or not there is a good social outcome, that is, a healthy forest. If you have a lot of sick trees, you cannot have a healthy forest. Now, so for Marx, there's no human agency. The idea of free will was an illusion, that you are compelled by the outside social forces to act accordingly. Whereas from the liberal perspective accepts the idea of free will. It doesn't mean that we have unlimited free will, or that we have an unlimited capacity to behave as we wish. We are influenced by our parents. We are influenced by our culture. We are influenced by our government. We're influenced by these things, but we still have a large degree of capacity to make our own decisions. Now, so for Marx, your class determined your social position. You were a worker or you were a capitalist. So Marx, divided the community up into classes that were antagonistic towards one another. The workers had different interests than the capitalists had different interests. Now, on the other hand, liberalism is about voluntary association, that you chose to come to Marroquin instead of to San Carlos because of the people that you would meet here or whatever. So you choose to be an evangelical, and you leave the Catholic Church because you have some sense of free association. Now, what usually guides people into this is their own sense of fairness and justice. So you felt like Marroquin would give you a better set of insights, or your parents decided for you, in terms of how you would live in a just society where fairness was important. Now, for Marx, socialism was the answer. Social ownership of capital was the answer. Now, so what happens is when you have socialism, you have to have a bureaucracy to decide on, how things happen. The bureaucracy are the people that the politicians hire to conduct government business. Now, in markets, all your interactions are based upon what you want or what you think you need. And this leads to prices which evolve from that sort of voluntary cooperative process. That's what the market is. It's a voluntary cooperative process where you're trying to make your life better off. I'm trying to make my life better off. We find a way of cooperating with each other so that both of us end up with a transfer that makes both of us better off. That's what markets are. You give up something you value less for something you value more, you're better off. And the other person gives up something they value less, and they get something they value more. Gains, net gains. Now, so what happens under Marxism or under socialism, the least important component of the central plan was the consumer, which was individuals. The consumer said under the Soviets or the Red Chinese, I don't like what the plan provides. Too bad. It's the plan. It's not about you, it's about the plan. It's not enough of that available. It's too bad. That's the plan. It's got nothing to do with you. It's the plan. Everything is about the plan. So if you tell the bureaucracy you have to follow the plan, and you will be judged based upon whether or not you deliver based upon the plan, then they don't care about the individuals. That's why there was so much misery in Red China before the reforms that brought China into the rest of the world, and the Soviet Union and North Korea. It's got nothing to do with human beings. It's got everything to do with the plan. Now, in markets, it's all about the humans. Jeff Bezos at Amazon cannot become rich or stay rich if he ignores what human beings want. Elon Musk, he's providing people with what they want. They are giving freely and voluntarily. It's not their fault that they're billionaires. It's your fault because you bought a Tesla or you bought from Amazon. They became rich because they made other people's lives better off, not because they made people worse off. Everybody that buys from Amazon is better off. Everyone that buys a Tesla believes they're better off by driving a Tesla. So, individuals are at the heart of market exchange. So Marx and the system that Marxists delivered is really inhumane in the sense that they don't care about humans. They care more about the plan. Does this plan support socialism? Does this plan support the Communist Party? And where do human beings fit in? They don't. Now, of course, the rhetoric was this is all about making humans better off. But they didn't do their homework. They didn't see, well, are humans better off? Of course not. Were humans better off in the Soviet Union than they were under the Tsar? The people that the Tsar of Russia sent into exile, almost all of them came back to become Bolsheviks to take over the Russian government to murder the Tsar. Now, almost all the Soviet citizens that were sent into exile into the gulags, they never came back. So, where were people made better off? Now, okay, what are the theoretical foundations? As I mentioned, Adam Smith began with scarcity and private property as the solution. Marx began with property relations or production relations, and he said, private ownership of capital, it's the biggest problem. We need to socialize. Okay. Now, so in other words, Marx really was starting with a very weak beginning. His philosophical construct was built on air. As opposed to Adam Smith, there was a solid foundation. Scarcity, that's a reality. You can't escape it. Everybody has to cope with scarcity. Whereas, this idea that the source of all conflict and problems is from private ownership. Without asking, well, is private ownership, why did it evolve that way? How did we end up with private ownership? He never asked that question. He just saw misery, private ownership, one leads to the other. Now, these are terms of reference that I'm going to look at. Marx talked about exploitation, alienation, and class struggle as the outcome of a capitalist system. So these are the three outcomes that Marx identified that would be corrected by social ownership of capital. Now, there are other things, I won't have time to talk about it, more theoretical things, labor theory of value and so on. I won't talk about those. I don't have time. So I'll look at, first of all, exploitation. Now, according to Marx, exploitation was a situation where your life is under the control of somebody else. Well, the somebody else for Marx was the capitalist. the evil manager. Now, I don't know, my family had private businesses, and the relationship between the owner of the business and the workers was very human. Now, this isn't the case, this is anecdotal, it's not the case for every uh, employer, but Marx overlooked the fact that employers depend upon a certain amount of loyalty and production from the workers that will come from having a human relationship with them. Now, my sister had to fire an employee who was stealing from her, and she couldn't do it. She knew he was stealing. She found the money, and she couldn't do it because she had a human connection with the guy. I had to go and fire the guy. We changed the locks on the door. I didn't feel good about it either. It wasn't my business. But, I mean, so Marx overlooked the possibility that that kind of existed. So what happened is the solution for Marx was central planning. Well, Marxists, the Marxists who followed the ideas of Marx introduced central planning. But this is the ultimate system of control, because central planning means you do this, I don't want to do that. You do this. It's a plan. It's not up to you. When I moved to China in 1987, almost every person who was not in the government living the life at very high levels, everybody that was a worker was assigned to a place to work. And they were born there, they lived there, they died there, they were fed there, they were schooled there, you had no choice. You couldn't migrate to another place, you couldn't take another job. You were part of the plan. That is control. There was no possibility, virtually no possibility, for someone to migrate from Shanghai to Beijing on their own initiative. Now, what happens is that when you give governments control, there is almost no freedom of choice. And that was the case in China under the communist regime as it was before Deng Xiaoping's reform. Now, what happens is in the market provides individuals with an opportunity to discover what they can do for other people to make the lives of those other people better off so that their life can be better off. This is what the market is about. It's about experimentation. Now, if I wanted to be a successful singer, I would fail because I would try my voice out and let you decide whether I was a good singer and whether you would reward me. You wouldn't, because I'm a terrible singer. But the market gives you an opportunity to discover. So it turned out that, and I think I'm a reasonably good lecturer now, but when I was young, I wasn't as experienced and I was pretty bad at it. But happily, the market didn't work very well. I would have been thrown out. But here I am. Now, so the market really is a discovery process about what we value as a community, not what the elite decides the community should want or what the community will receive under central planning. The market says, well, we discover what we want, what we value, based upon our individual preferences, our individual life goals, as opposed to the central planner. So, under this sort of argument of exploitation that Marx used, the person that's exploited is the individual, because you're forced to be a servant to the community. You're forced to act within the plan. You're not acting based upon your own self-interest. So, this is why Ayn Rand and the objectivists, she was born under the Soviet rule, so she rejected this idea of being a servant to the collective. The reality was with central planning, they're exploited. Marx had it completely wrong. The exploitation comes from political control of resources, political control of the economy. This is how the individual is exploited for the purpose of what? Well, the elite's idea of what the central plan should be. That's where exploitation resides. It's not the outcome of the capitalist system. So Marx insisted that workers own their own labor, and then what they produce should be kept. But this is what a libertarian would say. But Marx believed that, well, the way we do that is through socialism. The libertarians say, no, less political control. That's the way you keep what you earned. That's how you discover what is valuable. Now, alienation. According to Marx, alienation is that workers are separated from what they produce. That is, they're alienated from it, they're separated from it. And that you work only for survival. Now, Karl Marx grew up in the middle of the beginning, well, it's sort of the middle of the Industrial Revolution. And conditions in the factories during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution were terrible, almost inhuman. But why did people do that? Were these people made slaves to go into the manufacturing? No. They went in because their conditions as serfs, campesinos, in the agricultural sector was so terrible that going into these horrible factories was better, because the possibility of dying of hunger was much worse if you remained a campesino. So actually people were happy to go into these terrible conditions, and they were terrible, but the option was worse. Marx didn't understand this. He didn't understand, human motives for making decisions. So, now again, central planning was the solution, supposedly. But in fact, what central planning was bringing about was stagnation and shared misery. The condition of the individual worker in the Soviet Union was terrible. They were better off as peasants in many ways. Now the Tsar had ended serfdom as it existed in Russia. So the release of agricultural labor to be more free opened up the peasantry. Now, markets have led to prosperity. Now, alienation is really about being disconnected from other humans. It's not really about being disconnected with what you produce. Now, so the person that works in the Tesla factory, how many of them own Teslas? Most of them, they don't care. They'd rather have a gasoline-powered car. How many people that work, producing anything necessarily own, the person making shirts in Indonesia for Zara. They don't like those shirts because it doesn't fit their taste. So this isn't what it's about. What alienation is really about is, are you alienated from other human beings? Does the social and political system separate you from other human beings? Well, the central plan does that. Now, workers then just become part of a machine. Now, in markets, your value is to cooperate with me. You are valuable to me not because I love humans, but because I need humans. I don't have to love you. I just need to see that you can fulfill something that I require to make my life better. And we'll cooperate. I might still not like you. I say, I didn't like it. Doesn't matter. We're both made better off in the process. I mean, it would be nice that we loved each other after the fact, but we don't have to. Now, so central planning is that everyone is compelled to do what the plan says. There's no freedom of choice. And so you began to see people as, well, you don't even know who they are. You don't interact with them. Every day you interact with the people at E-Cafe or at Gitan or wherever, or Subway, just to give some examples here. And so you recognize them. You saw them yesterday. You interact with them. They remember you. So this is what markets do. This creates a human sort of feeling and empathy. Now, central planning divides people into whether or not they fit into the plan. You're going to be a civil engineer. I want to study music. You're going to be a civil engineer. You got no choice. You, according to the plan, will do what they tell you you must do. Markets allow individuals to be what they want to be. You may want to be a musician and you're bad at it. You keep trying. I had friends, God almighty, I had a good friend in college. He was terrible. Played the guitar. He wanted to be a musician. He kept going. He never made it. But, the market didn't value him, but he still wanted. But he still had the capacity to pursue this idiotic dream of his. But anyway, bless his heart. I don't know what happened to him. Now, the other thing that Marx talked about, so alienation, exploitation, class struggle, these are three elements here. So he put this at the heart of human relationships historically. So he saw, through his philosophical construct, history was about class struggle. Okay, for me, history was about trying to find a social and political system to resolve the conflicts over scarcity. It's a different set of questions, and you get different answers. Marx really started at the wrong place. Now, so what are the classes? Well, according to Marx, proletariat, bourgeoisie, or capitalists and workers. The class struggle was, there was a parasitic group. The capitalists are parasites. And by the way, what do you do with parasites? Well, you put insecticide or, antibiotics. You kill it. Humans are better off if you eliminate parasites. Now, so people say, well, but Marxism wasn't really about, violence. No, it was. Because if you depict a class of people as parasites, the world is better off without them. So you hand that over to a politician, and what do? Gulags, show trials, murders, or whatever. Now, class privileges are only to the capitalists. Well, I don't own capital. I have a lot of privileges. I can travel where I want to go. I don't need to own capital to be prosperous. But Marx saw the only rich people were capitalists somehow. And of course, that was probably more true then than it is now. But in other words, everybody else was suffering. Again, Marx did not really live in the real world. He lived in a philosophical construct. And everything had to fit within that philosophical construct. So if we get rid of private ownership of capital, we'll get rid of the class conflict. In other words, social ownership of capital. So all of a sudden, in his mind, workers are oppressed by this parasitic class, and their interests are opposed to the capital owners. What's the reality? Well, the reality is, again, scarcity. Scarcity gives us a solution. Well, the existence of scarcity requires a solution. Multiple solutions: socialism or private property, social ownership, private ownership. Private ownership provides us with a way of discovering how we can trade resources cooperatively, peacefully, voluntarily in order to make each other better off. There's a reason for it. Now, so what happens is we do have what I would call a ruling class. The ruling class are and all politicians, and certainly most in this country, but certainly in America, almost all of them are professionals. Almost none of them, unless they were lawyers, but almost none of them ran a business. They've always been either in university or a politician. So they are the ruling class, and they have the bureaucrats and the supporters, maybe the trade unions or some interest group, and they oppose the interests of the productive class. Who are the productive class? The productive class are the workers and the capitalists. Marx had it wrong. The interests of the workers and the capitalists coincide. The capitalists need the worker to get things done. The worker needs the capitalist to have an income. Their interests are aligned, not opposed. They're opposed to the ruling class, which are the politicians and the bureaucrats and their supporters who acquire political power to oppress the productive class, to tax them, to regulate them, to limit what they can do. So this is where we end. Marxism versus markets. Now, under Marxism, which, we could talk about communism or socialism. In other words, Marxism led people to believe in the social ownership of capital, the end of private ownership. So this was an ideology that led to this massive political control and central planning. Again, Soviet Union, Red China, North Korea, Democratic People's Republic of Kampuchea, all these terrible places. Now, what happened in all of these places, whether I don't know if you've seen the photos of Che Guevara or Fidel wearing Rolexes, which they may have taken off somebody's dead body, or you see all the Maduro, they have these $1,000 watches that you don't, well, maybe you have, I don't have. Well, where do they get that? I mean, they're supposed to be, well, what happens is that the political class looks after itself first. They look after them. So in the Soviet Union, it was a nomenclatura. There's a very good book called The House of Government, which is about an apartment complex for Soviet citizens. So, well, actually, nomenclatura, the high-level Bolsheviks. By the way, they were all liquidated eventually by Stalin. But while they were there, they lived like kings, or princes anyway. Now, also what we saw under Marxism, and all the people that, and in many countries that might even, they really pretended to be Marxist because they thought that other countries would support them. So there was, during the 1970s and 80s, there was something known as African socialism. The reason the Africans talked about socialism because they were waiting for the Swedish to donate to them and say, oh, you support socialism, so we'll give you some money. So many governments pretended to be Marxist or socialist because they were receiving aid from countries that were sympathetic, or they would get from the Soviet Union or from the Chinese. The communist governments between the Soviets and the Chinese under Mao and the Democratic Republic of Kampuchea, again, under the pretense of being Marxist, killed at least 100 million of their own citizens. They made Hitler look like a beginner. The wars that hit the conflict that Hitler precipitated killed off many fewer people, despite the liquidation of the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and deformed people, and then in the wars. Communism has been a killing machine because it doesn't hold the individual human being in its heart. It's the community. And if we have to sacrifice you for the good of the community, goodbye. You're expendable. It's about the community, the plan, the social context. Now, capitalism is not an ism. Capitalism isn't a belief structure. Socialism is a belief structure that if we have social ownership of capital and private property disappears, we will have a harmonious blah, 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 blah. It's an ideology, it's a belief system. Capitalism, George Soros is a very successful capitalist, and he has collectivist mentality. So he doesn't, you don't have to believe in the free market. You can be a socialist and be a successful capitalist. We know people do that. Capitalism is really an evolving system of human action. We discovered by living among each other, this was a better way to live because it leads to peace, harmony, improved material condition. If your material condition is better off, you have opportunities to improve your spiritual condition. So, capitalism, where we saw capitalism where it existed, we've seen a 10 times improvement of the condition of life. And in the developed economies, like in Europe, North America, it's gone up 30 times. Now, I lived in China in 1987 at the end of this sort of Maoist central planning. I was sent there or invited there by the Chinese government to teach them about free markets, which was interesting. Now, the condition of improvement in China over that time period is amazing compared to what it was in 1987. And it's because China entered into the rest of the world. Globalization and markets raised the living standard of the Chinese. Now, competitive markets really require institutional frameworks, and that is the Estado de Derecho, the rule of law. The rule of law means no privileges, that government officials have no privileges that normal citizens don't have. They can't earn more. They don't get better conditions, and they are treated by the legal system in the same way that everyone else is. It's equality. So this is the way to get prosperity, peace, love, and liberty. Now, it's not perfect. Again, you should be skeptical. I'm not giving you a utopian argument here. But what we see is that the utopian constructs from Marx and his followers, the Marxists, led to a disharmonious, alienating, exploitative system that really divided people rather than united them. It divided people into nomenclatura, that is, the people who ran the central plan, the politicians and so on, and the rest of the people who lived pretty miserable lives, like in Cuba. Look in Cuba. Now, I went to Cuba once, and Cuba had, at one time before the Castro, one of the largest middle class in all of Latin America, because it was a banking and trading capital of Latin America. So when you go there, the boulevards are full of this middle class housing. But now there's 10 or 20 families in each of those, and they live pretty miserably. Things haven't improved in Cuba since 56 or whatever it was, in general, except for the people with the Rolexes. And the only other Cubans with Rolexes live in Miami because they left. Now, Marx's view was a war against human nature. I think it's inescapable to make that. And the humaneness. There was not a feeling for humanity. I mean, there was rhetoric. But if you look at the results, the last least important element in a centrally planned economy is you, the human, the consumer, because you have to serve the plan. And if you oppose the plan, we'll liquidate you because you're against the collective. You're expendable. God Almighty, how do people not understand that? How can you be so ignorant of the historical outcomes of such a system? Now, of course, Marx and his followers would say, well, it's the system doesn't necessarily lead to that. It was the imperfections. Well, if you construct a system that does not anticipate the imperfections of those who implement, you failed miserably in your project. Now, what's the solution? More markets, more Mises, less Marx. Okay, thank you very much.